달라프레트 오메람기 브레기자테 톨라 두테 카르토비에.
Kungela kansa nyemi nga sena nyanzi sel ye tuani nga zo lop tu shiki ngune ume lamki tichi la shawa she tuba kariyata.
Please.
다시대 Sikyong 페르스가 예밍 우마텐진 근데 주라니 아니가 롭자라 ISFT chapter 6이 ISFT Berkeley 하래요. 당아 가리라 정의기 창마 브레이킹이가 토이면도 오시니가 인티그레이가 중지. My first question is about hydropower electric dams in Tibet. I understand that hydropower electric dams are harmful as they displace Tibetan communities, kill Tibetans, and destroy Tibetan agriculture. But I also understand that modernization is needed everywhere and that Tibet is in need of a power source for electricity. So I'm wondering if or how Tibet can implement a power source of electricity without being as harmful.
How Tibet can?
Implement a way for electricity without causing harm.
Hi, Darshana, I'm Tsering. I have a quick question, more of like your response to this take. I went to a talk last year and a professor at Columbia more or less said that like Tibet wouldn't be free or reach autonomy unless the communist regime collapses. I was wondering, like, do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? Like, what's your take on that?
So my question is this. So me personally, I think one of my greatest concerns is the continuation of the Tibetan Sunday schools, especially within exile. So whether that's in the United States or in Canada, I think that just as each subsequent generation goes on, we see a little bit of our diminishing culture and our language. So I was just wondering, what exactly is the CTA? Because I know that you mentioned the Department of Education, and I believe I did get to talk a little bit with the Department of Education minister, but I didn't really get a clear answer as to like what exactly the CTA was doing in support of the Tibetan communities and specifically the Sunday schools here. Just because I'm truly like a firm believer in education as a means of liberation, and so I was just wondering what the role of the CTA was in that.
We as a method of this here, and it's at the name of San Francisco to Tema, Sikyong, China, and Mixegi, and Shugetola, and communication hour, she's a D. Shugin, you are some good, she's a D. Bechane, and the Kumogi Katu Bene, and Shugesan Kamina, she's a number of million to what the day when the general of the Tibetan position, and yet position Malavis.
아메리카의 메시지 하대요. 근데 이번에 완성으로 결과로 와. 여러분 이제 순구리 whether you like it or not, in this life you have Tibetan blood, you have Tibetan bone, right? In the shadow rules of the thing, and the big shadow rules of the Canada didn't you are. And message from the America. You know, and the change and we are in exile. We were forced into exile to the Chinese government. Which occupied Chinese Communist China occupied Tibet. 아니 당연히 그게 다 이때 믹스치는 디스트리뷰션하고 이 유사마다 뭔가 nga do china nga tanda long up to nga guest le de nga jagale ke go nga pure ke go mare nga pure thon no mare. That's why to fulfill my emotional needs I go on the Indian border with Tibet and see Tibet from the Indian side. Of course I cannot step on Tibetan soil, but that is to fulfill my emotional needs. Yeah, I think what's not all those shit. And then during our lifetime, if we are able to achieve that, that's the best. If during our lifetime there is no resolution to the Sino-Tibet conflict, then the responsibility lies on you. Because you will have to take the responsibility. No one else will take the responsibility for us. Now, if you have to take the responsibility, then you have to understand Tibet. So otherwise, you will not be in a position to explain to other people about Tibet. So instead of talking about the larger global politics, geopolitics, geostrategic, all that, I thought it's important that you should know the basics about Tibet. Because we lived in India for 65 years, right? We assume that because of the popularity of His Holiness Dalai Lama, Indian people know about us. But it's an illusion. When we go speak to even educated intellectuals, they don't know much about Tibet. So we have to explain the basics about why Tibet is important, not only for Tibetans, but for the whole world. So one importance of Tibet is the geostrategic importance of Tibet, in the sense where Tibet is located. So Tibet is located this is Tibetan Plateau, and this is a satellite image. This is Asia, so you have India here, you have China this side, you have Mongolia and others, Afghanistan and Pakistan on the west. So Tibet is in the middle of Asia. So if you take the whole of Asia, then you can see that Tibet is very much in the center, in the heart of Asia. That is why the geopolitical or the geostrategic location of Tibet itself is very important. The subject on a image before the subject is natural boundary because of the geography. The subject is like Slide you attend Sunday, or some of you already attended Sunday class, weekend classes. So it's like next. For the long life of the 14th Dalai Lama, we have this prayer. The first line that is how we Tibetans define our own land. Right? In English, it's roughly the heavenly abode, the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. So now, it's not enough to say how it is surrounded by snow mountain ranges. In Afghanistan, Himalayas. So Himalayas, highest mountains are located there, and it's one of the longest mountain range. And in the west, you will find the Karakoram range. In the north, you will find the Zindan range, and in the east, you will find a series of mountain ranges. That is how Tibet is surrounded by snow mountain ranges. Himalaya yore, Nukmala, Karakoram yore, Changwala, Kunun yore, and Sharwala, Mongo yore, all those in the Hegavina. I think Mishabazo, oh, Perne, the Salachombo, Rasa Togo, and in Kachomburisha, Lachura. I think if you do get man, the Hagan and Doina, the Chogu means the Westerners. The immediate neighborhood of Tibet, we always had relations, but not many people could come into Tibet because you have to climb. There was no aeroplane those days. There were no motorable roads. You have to go by walk, or you have to ride horses or ponies. but it's not possible on the Himalayas. So physically, it's very difficult to come into Tibet for other people, for non-Tibetans to come into Tibet, and for Tibetans also to go out of Tibet. Again, you have to climb that many mountains and down valleys. So Tibet remained isolated for a very long time. Now, Westerners, the Europeans, the first group of Westerners who crossed over Tibet while coming from China back to Europe was sometime in the late 16th century. Then the first Westerner to cross over the Himalayas and started a Christian church in Tibet. These are the Paiyu they are, but Nepal is here. So they crossed over from Delhi to Agra to Darchula, they built the first Christian church. Now why that happened? Because Christianity was spreading. They sent Christian missionaries all around the world to spread Christianity, and they considered Tibet as the last frontier where Christianity could not penetrate. So there were a lot of excuses. Some say that, oh, Tibet is the holy land. Christian literature and all. In Christian literature, there is this holy land, and they thought that Tibet is the holy land. One other thing is there were a lot of traders coming into Tibet, into India during the Mughal period, and some say that some Christians got lost in the mountains. So they went looking for those Christians. In this Portuguese. One Portuguese person is called Antonio de Andrade. He was the first Westerner to come into Tibet and start a church in Tibet. And there's another group also who started a church in Shigatse around the same time, because at that time Bhutan was not even a kingdom. Bhutan became a kingdom around that time in 17th century. So this was the year 1626 when they started the first church in Tibet in 1626. And then later there were quite a number of Westerners who came to Tibet. There were French, there were Italians. There were quite a number of Italians who came to Tibet to spread Christianity. And the first American to come to Tibet was William Woodville Rocket. You can search his documents. He visited Tibet in 1889. This person was born in Pennsylvania, and then he was young. His mother, to avoid the civil war in the United States, took him to Europe. And then in France, they used to teach Tibetan language in 1842. Can you imagine? France, last year, this year, I was in France, and I went to speak to a university called Inalco University, and they told me that Tibetan used to be taught in France since 1842, in 19th century, mid-19th century. So I read one book by an American missionary who was posted on the Tibet-China border as part of the China mission. He should Tibet Frontier Outpost by 1906. He wrote a book called Tibet Frontier Outpost, and one of the chapters was titled as The Roof of the World. Maybe from that time, Westerners started calling Tibet the roof of the world. Or maybe there were references to Tibet as roof of the world earlier than that, which I'm not aware of. And then, according to NASA, NASA, the average elevation, altitude, height of Tibet is about 4,880 meters, or equivalent to 16,010 feet above sea level. So when I travel around the world, wherever I go, I check the highest mountain in those countries. Like Japan, I ask them, which is your highest mountain? Which is the highest mountain in Japan? Mount Fuji. Then I ask them, what is the altitude? They say 3,700, 3,800 meters. Then I was telling the same thing in New Zealand also. New Zealand, the highest mountain is Mount Cook. That's also about the same elevation. The highest mountain in Japan, I told them, is like base camp in Tibet. So you start climbing from there. So just to give them an imagination as to how high Tibet is, how high the Tibetan Plateau is. And according to NASA, of course, there are several plateaus in this world, but Tibet is the highest plateau in the world. Then it's home to Mount Everest, which is about 8,848 meters or 29,029 feet. And Tibet is huge. Tibet is not a small country. Sometimes we Tibet by size is not a small country. So comparatively, Tibet is about 18 times the size of Japan, 10 times the size of UK. Europe, Austria, it's about 30 times the size of Austria. And one time, a journalist asked me, which is bigger, Bhutan or Tibet? You need 100 Bhutan to make one Tibet. So it's that big. And that is also the reason why Tibet is important geostrategically. Then, according to scientists, they say this Tibetan plateau, this is the Indian plate and this is the Eurasian plate. So the Indian plate was called the Gondwanas and it was a separate land. Now over 50 million years ago, then this tectonic shift happened and the Gondwana plate went underneath the Asian plate and these mountains came up about 50 million years ago. Right? Even now, scientists, according to Geological Survey of America, they say that it continues to grow by about 10 millimeter every year. So 10 millimeter is about noodle thick. So which means to say that the tectonic shifts are still happening and it's still growing. And all these areas are prone to earthquake. Right? It's all seismic zone. And then human habitation on this plateau, as of the findings today, dates back to more than 30,000 years. So in future, if there are new findings, it may still go back more than 30,000 years, but as of today, they say the human habitation, according to a scientific journal, dates back to about 30,000 years. And Tibetan civilization is also very old. People lived on this plateau for that long. Now, environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole. The third pole. The pole Shemanidi, North Pole, South Pole. So why environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole? It's just not enough to say Tibet is the third pole, right? So this term, the third pole, was coined by a Westerner around 1932, but not widely used. Now, you find reference to Tibet as third pole even in the COP meetings, and how the COP meetings, the international environmental conferences are not giving enough focus on the Tibetan plateau. So why they call it the third pole? This map is to show you the permafrost and ground ice on Tibet. So in the next slide you will see that Tibet has the largest reservoir of glaciers and permafrost outside the two poles, Arctic and the Antarctic, right? And Tibet has about, according to UN Environment Program, UNEP, they say Tibet has about 46,000 glaciers, and it holds about 14,500 cubic kilometers of glacial ice. That is according to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And people say that Tibet regulates climate in that region. The Tibetan Plateau regulates the climatic conditions. So it decides the monsoon, which is the rainfall in India and surrounding areas. Some say that jet streams that flow over the Tibetan Plateau decides the climatic conditions in the neighboring countries. And also because of the El Nino impact. El Nino is the warming of the Pacific. It decides the climatic conditions in these regions. Last year, I went to Brazil and to Colombia and Mexico. And just before going there, I read a scientific journal which correlated the climatic conditions in Amazonia
And Amazonia is called the lung of the world because it has so many forests there, right? And Tibet is the roof of the world. And they are on exact polar side of the world, on two different sides of the world. Just like the North Pole and South Pole, Tibet, the roof of the Tibet is here, the roof of the world is here, and Amazonia is on the other side of the world. Then people might wonder, what has Amazonia to do with the roof of the world? So scientists found that they studied climate change impacts from Amazonia to Tibet, and they found that when there is more rain in Amazonia, then there is less snow in Tibet. When there is more snow in Tibet, then there is less rain in Amazonia. So those correlations are also there. It shows how interdependent we are, even on climate change. Then, now Asians call Tibet the water tower of Asia. It's just like water tank in Asia because of Tibet's altitude. So you can see why they call it the water tower of Asia. It's also connected with the third pole, right? Because of the glaciers and permafrost that Tibet has. So major rivers in Asia originate from the Tibetan Plateau or from Tibet. So in the east, you have the Yellow River that originates from Tibet and goes into China. Now, if you have read about civilizations, the Chinese civilization was formed on the bank of Yellow River. And this river and the Yangtze River, which originates from Tibet and flows into China, are the two lifelines of China. Without these two rivers, China cannot support its 1.4 billion people. According to scientists, some say the underground water in China, about 60% of China's underground water is polluted, which means it cannot even be used for irrigation. And about 50% of China's surface water is polluted. So for the very survival of the Tibetan, for the Chinese people, the water that originates from Tibet is very, very crucial. So it's very important even for the Chinese themselves to make sure that Tibet's environment is protected for their own well-being. And then you have the Mekong, which originates from here, then goes into 5 different Southeast Asian countries. It goes into Laos, Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. So 5 countries, the Mekong flows and reaches these. Now, I was also in Cambodia, I was also in Thailand, and when you go there, now you read more issues about people's livelihood being changed because China does not share any hydrological data with downstream countries. Forget about water sharing. With India, they have just started discussing about sharing hydrological data because if you don't share hydrological data, in India also we had in 2008 there was a major incident called an artificial lake was formed called Parichu, and China did not share the hydrological data, and then this got burst. Right? This artificial lake got burst, and then the downstream India, many people got killed. So if you don't share hydrological data, this also has serious consequences. Then there are 2 other rivers that goes into Burma, the Tsering and the Irrawaddy, 2 rivers. And this is River Tsangpo, Brahmaputra, which originates from Western Tibet, comes to Eastern Tibet, takes a U-turn here, and then comes into India and then Bangladesh. Now at this place called Penpa in Tibet, Metok, they are building a mega dam. Now which is the biggest dam in the world today? The Three Gorges Dam. The Three Gorges Dam is also in China. Now this dam is supposed to produce 3 times the hydroelectricity than the Three Gorges Dam. Right? So you can imagine how much water needs to be stored upstream and how much flora and fauna that is very unique to the Tibetan environment will get submerged and get destroyed. And how many Tibetan villages and monasteries will get submerged. That is at least one part. But I also told you that the whole area is seismic zone. Now if something happens to this size of a dam here, because of earthquake or something, some natural disaster, then water will come into these areas. The people in Arunachal Pradesh, in the state of Assam in India, and Bangladesh will get washed away with that amount of water. So it will have serious human catastrophe if this dam is built, and in future if something happens to that size of a dam. But the larger idea is China wants to divert all of Tibet's water up north because north of China is getting parched, right? So they have major plans to take this river along this side and then take it north. There are these some kind of reports about ICD reports, and then you have another smaller river that originates from Tibet, comes into Nepal and joins the Ganges. It's called Karnali. So Tibetan river also flows into Nepal. Then you have the Ganges. Ganges flows from the Indo-Tibetan border, and then it flows into India. It's one of the most sacred rivers in India. Then you have the two rivers that flows in the west. There's the Sutlej and the Indus that flows into India. Then it flows into Pakistan. And Indus is the cradle of Indus Valley civilization. So on the Yellow River you had the Chinese civilization. On the Indus you had the Indus Valley civilization, two of the most oldest civilizations in this world. So water that originates from Tibet is not only important for Tibet, but for the whole region. In the next slide also you will see, but the countries that I talk about, right, from Pakistan to Nepal to India to Bangladesh and five Southeast Asian countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Burma, and China, they are some of the most densely populated areas in the world. Because India has 1.4 billion, China has 1.4 billion. These two countries alone is about 2.8 billion out of 8 billion people in this world. So people say, these 10 countries I already mentioned, and people say that between 1.8 billion to 2 billion people have something or the other to do with rivers that originate from Tibet. Their livelihoods are dependent on rivers that originate from Tibet. And we are talking about, since the population is very high, we are talking about these. You will study later if you spend a little more time in studying all this. You will find that these will become major issues for global food security and water security issues. So these will become major issues. When you grow up, you will hear more and more about food security and water security. And some say that a third world war could happen because of water. So if that is the case, then Tibet is a huge bio hotspot. It's going to be very, very important. And then I talked about the rainmaker. The Tibetan Plateau influences the timing and the intensity of monsoons. It decides which are going to be the hotspots in India. Then the depression sets in, and then the rainfall. So now rainfall in the Indian continent is going to increase because of the precipitation over the Tibetan Plateau. Then heat waves also are getting worse. The worsening heat conditions in Europe are also impacted by the thinning of snow on the Tibetan Plateau. Now the snow melt on the Tibetan Plateau is twice the speed than normal in other countries, and it's 3 times the speed in the polar regions, in North Pole and South Pole. So in Tibet, it's twice the speed. So water is melting very fast in Tibet. If water melts in Tibet, there will be no more water to supply to all these countries. The 10 rivers that we are talking about, that goes into 10 different countries. Now this is a new report that the International Campaign for Tibet came out about a month ago. This time, when we were in Washington, D.C., ICT team was there, and Tanula had taken this map out of that presentation. And these are all dams that Chinese government is planning. The red ones, the black ones are the proposed, and the yellow ones are in preparation. The red ones are under construction, and the maroon ones are operating. It's all done, and these are operating. So we are talking about, so every river in Tibet, these are not marked, but they are smaller streams up there, right? So every river in Tibet, you find multiple dams that China is building. So which means China wants to control all resources, including water, which is one of the most important resources, right? So this finding talks about at least 193 dams that they found physically, and they have marked in all these locations. But the unmarked ones, they feel that it could go up to 300 dams inside Tibet. and damming of Tibet's water to produce hydroelectricity, to take it to eastern China. All this hydroelectricity goes to eastern China. Now, this year you must have heard. This year you must have heard that there was a major dam being built in Kham area, right? Between Dege and Jomda. So this is just one of the dams that Chinese government is planning out of 13 dams in the upper reaches of Yangtze. So Tibetans, on their knees were pleading to the Chinese government not to build this dam because it's going to submerge a lot of land, destroy old monasteries and also Tibetan townships. So Chinese government doesn't care about what happens to Tibetans. They just do what they want to do. But we have to create awareness in the international community to put pressure on the Chinese government that whenever they do any developmental work, including damming, they should be conscious of environmental repercussions because of these dammings. So this is just to give you an overview. So in the other map, in this you can see China today is 1.4 billion people, and they are the largest Asian country in Asia, apart from Russia, right? And then India is also home to 1.4 billion people. So between these two nations, Tibet has always remained as a buffer. So there was never ever in history a war between India and China because there was never ever a common boundary between India and China. But then Chinese occupied Tibet in 1950, right? And then it became India-China border. Even now, Indian government has not changed the name of the forces on the border. They still call it Indo-Tibetan Border Police, Indo-Tibetan Border Force. So I keep telling the Indian people also that that also underlies India's position on Tibet and the Tibetan border, right? So Tibet has always played the role of a buffer. Now, through the middle way, if we can find a non-violent, negotiated, mutually beneficial, both for the Chinese people and the Tibetan people, a solution, then that could be lasting, because non-violent solutions could be lasting. If you look at the world today, you talk about Israel-Gaza conflict that is going on, Ukraine, Russia, there. Some say that there are 55 violent conflicts going on around this world. And just a few days back I was reading, this might be one harsh with
It's too hot. I'm sweating.
So geostrategically, and then if you have to understand the geostrategy of that region, then you have to understand China-Pakistan relation, China-Nepal relation, China-Bhutan. These countries we have to understand. Then only we will understand the geostrategic importance of Tibet. So if Tibet issue or the Sino-Tibet conflict can be resolved peacefully, then there is a lot of potential to bring more peace and stability in the whole region. Then China and India does not need to be confronting each other. No, okay? The second one is the importance of the environmental importance of Tibet, which I already deliberated, right? The third importance of Tibet, not only to the Tibetans, but also globally, is the Tibetan Buddhist culture. So Tibetan Buddhism came to Tibet around 8th century. We, as His Holiness always says, we follow the Nalanda tradition, right? So 8th century, there were Chinese, also Chinese Buddhists in Tibet during King Tsering. Of course, in 7th century, the Tibetan script was invented. There must have been a spoken language, but the script, Tibetan script, comes from India, based on Devanagari script. I say this because today, Chinese government, or some people ask us, since Tibet is occupied by China, well, does Tibetan language have anything to do with Chinese? You have to, if you know that, you can categorically say that Tibetan language has nothing to do with Chinese language, but it comes from Devanagari script in 7th century, during King Songtsen time. You must have studied in your Sunday classes, right? Then the same king had several wives, Tibetan wives, and then he had a Chinese consort and a Nepalese consort. So Chinese government claimed its sovereignty over Tibet because the Tibetan emperor had a Chinese wife. So if that is the case, if that is the logic, the same emperor had a Nepalese wife. Okay, so Nepal can also claim sovereignty over Tibet, which Nepal is not doing. But Chinese reasoning is getting hollow because there's not enough reason. 굉장히 당금이도와 먼저 대시가 잡아이네. 교육이 개부지기 개미기 주무지 건조기 너가시는 때가 말와. 그 개부도 똑 쳐보여 성당. Because the Tibetan emperor was very powerful that they had to give their princess as consort to the Tibetan emperor. Then both of these princes brought one Buddha statue to Tibet. And 대신에 단단하도 조가나라 별 하설이야 조가나노래야 좀바도와 그래서 생각이 얘만 아니 개사단 배사 왼전 공주단 브리코드 대비 these two are supposed to have brought, but Buddhism formally was not introduced in Tibet because the Tibetan language just came into being, and His Holiness even now says that Tibetan emperors were very smart. They got the language from India, and they were Chinese, then they were Indian masters in Tibet in 8th century, Shantarakshita and his disciple Kamala Shila. Kamala Shila and the Chinese Hoshang had a debate in front of the Tibetan emperor. And then the Indian master won, and we decided to adopt Indian Buddhism. I say this because, again, China today claims that Tibetan Buddhism went from China. Of course, Buddhism went from India to China several centuries before it came to Tibet. But the precepts of Buddhism that we practice today, the Nalanda tradition, did not come from China. The Chinese Hoshang was defeated, and then the Tibetan emperor decided that he would follow Tibetan Buddhism. So we transliterated almost every available Sanskrit and Pali Buddhist text into Tibetan from 8th century to 13th century. So today we are a repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom, and we are very proud of that, right? No other languages in this world, no other Buddhist countries have the same amount of or same volume of Buddhist texts being translated into their languages. In countries like Thailand, Burma, Laos, all this, they didn't translate into their language. They kept the same Pali tradition, right? But Tibetans translated everything. So that is why His Holiness says that if you have to study Tibetan Buddhism, then Tibetan language is the best language to understand the precepts of Buddhism. This also talks about now, Buddhism is based on non-violence, on peace, compassion, right? So when there are so many violent conflicts in this world, the message of the Buddha, which is encapsulated in the form of messages through His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the world, is very, very important and very, very relevant. Because if you look at Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia conflict that is going on, you don't know whether you are resolving one conflict now or are you creating more problems for future. People as young as you see people being killed, bombed, every single day if you watch news. Then what kind of impact it will leave on the emotions of these people? What kind of imprints it will leave on the emotions of these people? When they grow up, they may take vengeance. So the world becomes more and more violent. So the message of non-violence and peace and the compassion to resolve all kinds of conflicts is very, very important. And that is also the reason why His Holiness proposed the middle way policy to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict. Okay, so again, before we talk about the middle, I'll just give you an overview of Tibetan history, because China claims its sovereignty on Tibet based on history. Right? So we should know how we have to argue back against the Chinese as to how Tibet was not part of China historically. So in this you can see the Song dynasty is too early, so we can leave it that, but the Yuan dynasty in China is that period when the Mongols invaded China. Tibet at one time was a huge empire. Between 7th to 9th century, we even captured the capital of China, dethroned the emperor and put in a puppet king in 8th century, right? And this is not today's Beijing or Nanjing before that, but those days the capital of China was Xi'an or Xiangyang. So from that Xiangyang to present day Uzbekistan, Samarkand in Uzbekistan, that used to be the extent of Tibetan Empire at one time. So Tibet was a major power at one. We should be proud of this. We talk about Songzhen Gampo, Chison Dezen, Chirobachin, up to those periods. And then Tibet disintegrated for about 400 years, up to 13th century. But even at the end of those disintegrated periods, when there was not one single king who could rule the whole of China, Tibet, but I say Tibet's frontiers were very, very well protected. Because a few years ago, I was in eastern India to find out on the Google about a temple in Kolkata that was built by the Panchen Lama. So while doing that, I also found that beginning of 13th century, when Genghis Khan was becoming a big empire, big emperor in the region, well, they were merciless. If they have to capture San Francisco, they come to, if they are coming from south, they come through San Diego and they kill everybody. By the time they reach here, everybody surrenders for fear of being mercilessly decimated, right? So, but in 1206, India was ruled by the Khiljis, and they sent 10,000 army into Tibet, and only 100 returned back, which means to say that even though Tibet was disintegrated, Tibetan frontiers were very well protected. So Tibetans developed relations with the Mongols in 1247, around mid-13th century, because the Mongol emperors were looking for a spiritual master, and they found Sajya Pandita Kungwa Gyaltseng as the most suitable imperial preceptor to teach spirituality to the Mongol kings. And then later, who is the nephew of Sajya Pandita Kungwa Gyaltseng, ruled Tibet and introduced what is called the pension system of governance in Tibet. And after we established relations with the Mongols, then Kublai Khan, the fifth Khan, invaded China, right? When the Mongols ruled China, and that period of 1271 to 1368, when the Mongols, Kublai and his successors ruled China, that period is called Yuan dynasty in Chinese history. But the Mongols were there even before that. Mongols were there even after that. So this is the period when the Tibet was ruled by the Sajapas. Then Mongols were overthrown by the Mings. Mings are real Chinese, Han Chinese. So today we have a lot of, in China also there were a lot of academic discourses as to who's the real Chinese. Is it only the Han, or the Tibetans also Chinese, or Mongols also Chinese, or Manchus also Chinese? So if Mongols are also Chinese, then they can claim half of the world because Mongols conquered that much area, right? Kublai Khan got that. Genghis Khan and his successors invaded many parts of the world. So when the Mings overtook and ruled China from 1368 to 1644, a little more than 300 years, parallelly in Tibet, we had three dynasties. The Pamodruba dynasty, who ruled Tibet for about 100 years. Then that was followed by the Rinpoche dynasty for about 100 years. Then they were followed by Devacangpa for about 100 years. So parallelly, from 1368 to 1642, Tibet was ruled by the three dynasties. And China was ruled by the Mings. We didn't have much to do with the Ming dynasty, right? And then the Mings were overthrown by the Qings. Now Qings are Manchus. Do you watch Kung Fu movies, Chinese Kung Fu movies? If you watch Chinese Kung Fu movies, you will find in contemporary story, you will find that Chinese are all protagonists. All the antagonists, in Hindi we say Dakus, right? All the Dakus are Manchus. So the societal perspective of the Chinese people is that Manchus are not Chinese. But today, China claims that Manchu dynasty is also a Chinese dynasty. So the Manchus ruled China from 1644 to 1911, right? And Tibet, now if you look at that, see here you find 1644, but Tibet in 1642. We have to change this, we have to improvise this presentation. So 1642 years before the Manchus overthrew the Mings, the fifth Dalai Lama had already taken over the spiritual and temporal leadership of Tibet in 1642, 2 years before. Then why it was not the same period? This is what. Then the Dalai Lamas, from the 5th Dalai Lama till the 14th Dalai Lama, ruled China, Tibet, right? And China was ruled by the Manchus till 1911. Then that was followed by, of course, from 1911, then there was the nationalist movement, which is called the Kuomintang. And then you have the Kuomintang, which is the Communist Party since 1949 in China. Okay? And then 1950, they sent army into Tibet and captured Chamdo. That used to be our border on the eastern side in Kham. And that was on October 5, 1950. Just 1 month after that, on 17th November 1950, the 14th Dalai Lama at the age of 16. Who among you are 16 years of age? At your age, His Holiness the Dalai Lama had to take over the temporal and spiritual leadership of Tibet. Now, what was I doing when I was 16? Now, what are you doing when you were 16, when you are 16? We are still studying, right? But the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, had to take over at a very, very crucial period of our history when the Chinese just invaded Tibet, and then His Holiness had to flee on the Indian border, stayed there for around 7 months in Tomo, and then during that period, we were forced to sign this so-called 17-point agreement by the Chinese government, right? So I'm telling you all this just to give you a imprint, then you can read more documents, books, right? So today I carried 2 books with me when I traveled around the world, because one thing is that the Chinese government, we have to take a position on the Tibetan history. When we say middle way, when we say middle, then we talk about polarities, right? Without polarities, there is no middle. So one polarity is the present situation of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese government, and the other polarity is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. So His Holiness is trying to find a middle way called the genuine autonomy, because in Tibet, they still call it Tibet Autonomous Region, Tibet Autonomous Prefecture, Tibet Autonomous County, but there's no real autonomy. It's only their name. So, genuine autonomy, not just only in name, but also in practice. Right? So that is what His Holiness is trying to seek. A solution that is mutually beneficial both for the Chinese and Tibetan people. So now, if there is no recognition for the polarities or extremities, then there is no value for middle way. That is why China is not responding to our call to negotiate. That is why we have to go to the international community seeking their support to ask China to negotiate with us peacefully, to find a resolution that is peaceful. Because His Holiness appreciates the concept of European Union. If His Holiness even now says that if it had not been for the European Union, Europeans would still be fighting with each other. You must have heard history of Europe where England and France fought for about 400 years. Now, after the formation of European Union, Europeans live in peace with each other, but of course now they are facing aggression from Russia. So this book, I would highly recommend you read this. I told the elders also in this building last night, I was telling them that many Tibetans don't focus on Tibetan history. Right? Okay, first message is to the Chinese government that they cannot change history, because history is in the past. So they put condition on His Holiness the Dalai Lama, saying that His Holiness should say that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Now His Holiness says, I am a Buddhist monk, I cannot lie. Right? His Holiness cannot lie. And His Holiness is very smart in giving right answers. So he says, I am not a historian. Let us leave history to historians. What I am trying to seek through the middle way is mutually beneficial, both for the Chinese people and the Indian people. And whether we like it or not, we are neighbor of China and India since time immemorial, right? So you heard about the Indian monkey god called Hanuman? Yeah? Okay. So those who have not heard, there is this Indian mythological god called Hanuman, who is supposed to have the power to lift mountains, right? So we don't have a Hanuman to lift Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere in the Atlantic or Pacific near you, right? So whenever we get to go back to Tibet, we have to live in Tibet. And we have to live with Chinese as neighbors. We have to live with Nepalese and Bhutanese and Indians also as neighbors. So if you have to live as neighbors, why don't we live in peace with each other? That is the whole message of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So to gain traction, to gain value, and to gain leverage for the middle way, then we ask governments to recognize the historical status of Tibet. Otherwise, middle way has no value. So for that, now I carry this one book. Last night, if you were, some of you were there at the public meeting, you can also, when you find time, I would highly recommend the Tibetan Association here to invite Michael Van Walt, the author of this book, is very much here in Bay Area. Michael Van Walt Van Praag. So he was a Dutch person, and he, at the age of 17, way back in the 70s, he met His Holiness the Dalai Lama for the first time. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama visited Europe for the first time in 1973. And His Holiness visited United States for the first time in 1979. So Michael studied international law, right? And he had written a lot of documents on Tibet, including the legal status of Tibet, political status of Tibet, and all that in the past. Now he came out with this book about four years ago. And he looked at the history of Tibet from the international legal perspective. And he proves the reason why I mention all these names, it won't make sense if I don't mention this overview of history. He proves that whether it's Tibet, Yuans are Mongols, right? Tibet, Yuan, Tibet Ming, who are real Chinese, Tibet Qings are Manchus. Or as per international law today, he proves that Tibet has never been considered part of China. Right? So this is very important for you to read so that you get a perspective of international academic research on Tibet. And then if you read Tibetan history from the political history of Tibet by Shagapa, Seven Shagapa, all that, then you will get different perspectives. Then you have to also understand how China is trying to claim its sovereignty over Tibet. So if you know the details, then you can fight back. You can argue back and say it's not so. Tibet was independent. So how was Tibet independent? This book will help you through the international legal perspective as to how Tibet was not considered part of China. So I'll circulate this to you. You take pictures from your mobile phone, get it from Amazon. There will be an Asian version also coming out because this is, it's called Tibet Brief 2020. So if you look at the cover, it'll look like you're going to an eye clinic. Because his idea was that the history of Tibet is not known to the world. It's very blur. And now that he wrote this, he researched and he wrote this book, it has become very clear, like 2020. I don't know, and this is a clinical term in ophthalmology. 2020 means very clear, right? And then this other book is by a Chinese. And this is in Chinese, so I don't think any of you can read Chinese. But this is written by a Chinese professor. Right? Chinese professor, when he was in his university days, maybe at your age, then he was hearing the Chinese government asking other governments to say Tibet is part of People's Republic of China. So he was wondering, because he kept hearing that the Chinese government saying Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. So if Tibet had been part of China since ancient times, then why is the present communist government asking every government to say Tibet is part of PRC? So he was intrigued by this question, and then he became a professor for life. And this author lives very nearby from you, about 4 or 5 hours by drive. So he lives in San Diego. This time I'm not able to go to LA, so otherwise LA, San Diego, I would have met him there. So he wrote this book based on Chinese imperial historical records. And Chinese are very well known to have a systematic record of history. When the one dynasty ends, the other dynasty revises the whole history and they lay it down. Right? When the Yuan finished, the Mings came, the Ming revised the Yuan history. Just like when the Ming got finished, the Manchus, the Qings revised the history. So it's very, very well documented. They cannot argue back. So he looked at the Imperial Chinese historical record. He took all these materials from the Communist Party website, all right? And it's an old Chinese, so he made it into new Chinese language, and this is not written in the form of a historical narrative. This is more an argument as to how Imperial China, if you can consider Yuan and the Qings also as Chinese dynasties, then how Imperial China had never considered Tibet as part of China. And coming from a Chinese professor, this is very valuable book, right? So Tibetan version has been translated by Sikyong, and it was published by the Tibetan Library of Works and Archives in Dharamshala. Those who can read Tibetan, you can order from there. And the English version will come out in about 3 months' time. So professor doesn't want any mistake because he says, I'm confronting Chinese government. So I don't want simple mistakes or silly mistakes in my book. So when you change from one format to another in computer, then the indent